Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of the Reimagine podcast. And Laura, good to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here, Paul, as always.
Okay, and I think we're going to talk about the power of stories for raising money, power of storytelling for getting an opportunity to win a client, and really build a business. Is that what we're going to cover today?
Absolutely, and we have two individuals here with us in studio to talk about that from different perspectives. We have Patrick McGloin, Vice President of Gaffney Bennett Public Relations, and Rory McGloin, Founder and President of RPM Communication Consulting. So two different viewpoints to talk about this very important conversation around communication. And with that, Rory, I invite you to kind of give a brief background on yourself and what got you interested within the communications field and what keeps you going here.
Yeah, awesome. Laura, Paul, thanks so much for having us. Looking forward to this all week. So excited to be here. My name is Rory McGloin. I'm a Connecticut native, born in Hartford, and I've spent the last 15 years in and around professionally the field of communication. I'm a UConn Husky, master and PhD there, where I studied communication, and particularly spent a lot of time looking at how we interface with media and how it influences our experiences when we meet in these types of virtual spaces with one another, which has become, of course, really prevalent in the COVID and post-COVID world. I have served in higher education for a long, long time, but I really wanted to be able to bring some of my skills and abilities and to be able to provide them to folks outside of the UConn or higher education community. So a couple of years ago, started my own consulting firm, and it really gives me access to be able to provide these lessons and, little tips and tricks and best practices to large organizations, small organizations, and individuals. It's something I'm really passionate about and enjoy helping others to find and hone their craft for great storytelling and just ultimately getting their message across. So happy to talk about this.
That's great. And Patrick?
Laura and Paul, great to be with you, and also with my slightly taller, slightly younger cousin, Rory. Similar origins, being a Connecticut native, born in Hartford, but took a slightly different track career-wise. I sort of came up through the political campaign and public affairs space, and you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, about just how much of getting your story distilled, understanding your audience, and getting it out in a clear, compelling fashion is really integrally woven into how the public affairs and political campaigns, how those two spaces work. So it's sort of a natural evolution for me to end up in a public. We're a public relations firm, but we have a sweet spot in public affairs, and have had a great opportunity to work with a ton of different clients of all sort of sizes and shapes to help them pull together a story that's going to help them get their story told. And a lot of times it's crafting a compelling narrative that you tell in good times. Sometimes it's trying to get your story straight out in front of important audiences when you're in the grips of a crisis. But it's still really fulfilling and exciting work, and glad to be with you guys to talk a little bit about it today.
Well, great. And Patrick, it's interesting. I'll just a little slightly similar career paths, and when I came out of school, I ended up working like an entire election cycle. So Senate campaign, and then I worked for a bunch of sort of state races down in Florida for a consulting company, and it was very interesting. I don't think most people would see this, but I don't you see like enormous parallels between launching a campaign and launching like a small business? Crafting a product, looking for product market fit, and actually seeing if you can actually, if the great funnel leads to success.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree entirely, man. I think if you are, you're launching a new business or an organization, you need to be able to describe your value proposition. We've all heard about the elevator speech and getting that message across. I mean, you were probably doing the same thing on your campaigns with your candidates, that they're going to be on the stump. There's a limited amount of time. You've got these voters' attention for a brief period, or maybe they're in front of the media for a press avail, and you need to have your story straight, and hopefully that you've thought through some of the pitfalls, and you can avoid the tricky spots, and you can make sure that you're focusing on the positive attributes. That's what's going to get you to the next level. You're going to launch that business, or hopefully survive the election and get sworn in shortly thereafter.
Yeah, and Rory, I think last time I looked, I think there were maybe 1,500 insurtechs competing to sell their services to either individuals direct or to carriers. It's incredibly hard to cut through the clutter if you don't have the story correct. I mean, how many of these companies do you think truly have a story that is compelling? If these were candidates, they'd win an election, and which ones don't?
I think it'd probably be fair to say to all of them, they have a story. Their ability to articulate it in a compelling fashion that resonates with their audience is really where we see the gaps. I think one of the things that stands out to me, I was spending a lot of time with entrepreneurs, working in incubation programs, trying to help them with their ability to raise capital and even sometimes raise employee talent, right? Attracting talent to want to be a part of your team is part of this pitch process, so we shouldn't overlook that either. And one of the things that we'll talk about early in these development processes is they'll come at the innovation and say, this fills a gap in the marketplace. And let me tell you why. And what I try to let them in on the secret is that chances are the vast majority of those venture capitalists, those investors, are your future employees. They know very little to nothing about the innovation that you're bringing to society. But what they do know is how the product or service currently exists. So can you connect with them where they're at in a way that is going to move them emotionally to simply want to pay attention to you? And that's where story comes into play. And so ultimately, I think they all have it, but they overlook it because they think that it's required of them to demonstrate how great the product or service is and how it's going to fill this market gap. The question that I have for them in return, and for anybody who's listening that fills in that space, is why are you the right people to fill it? Right? So we walk around our homes all the time. We live our lives, and we see things where we go, it would be great if they had a widget that would solve this problem for me. Boy, I would be a millionaire. We've all said it. There's a reason that we don't end up doing it because we don't have the knowledge, the expertise, the passion, the backing, the resources, whatever it may be, so we don't fulfill it. So when I hear an entrepreneur present, when I hear somebody on the campaign trail present, they need to be compelling to me that they are the right person at the right time to fulfill that need. And the product or service to me then comes with them, right? When I get the person, I get their ideas and I get their network and their resources. And I think one of the things that we need to do a better job is in helping our ecosystem, particularly here in the Hartford and the Connecticut region. Let's do a better job of helping our startups tell their story more efficiently, more effectively, so that they can actually get to doing what it is that they're great at.
Yeah, you used the word emotional, right? Insurance. Wait, insurance is all about numbers. It's filled with actuaries. Patrick, I'm a candidate. Here's my 1,000-page policy, for proposal for healthcare reform, right? How do you make emotional connections as a founder? Yes, I've got a widget, I've got a cup, it holds coffee, it stays warm. What's the secret sauce to getting the emotional connection here, especially in a very much a left brain world?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think mechanically, what I think you do want to probably, to the extent possible, take advantage of every resource that's going to help you sharpen up your message. And taking that 1,000-page plan, it could be your health policy as a candidate, or all the details behind the widget that Rory's describing. One thing that you can do is get as much research done into your target audience as possible. That could even include conducting firsthand research, surveys, and focus groups to really understand where is that connection between the problem you're looking to solve and people's perception. Because you might find out that 1,000-page plan is not scratching people where they itch. So then you got to pivot and you got to retool. And I'm sure the same thing happens when you're launching a product or some other innovation that you're very passionate about it, you're very emotional about it, but it's not quite what people are looking for. I think once you've gotten it tuned up to the point that your audience can really appreciate what you're proposing, you got to make it brief. That's really a specialty of mine. I always get to the point very quickly, in a clear and compelling fashion. That's where the challenge of potentially bringing in some help. If you're not built for communicating, getting some folks sort of know this world can really make the difference. One of my favorite stories is this old story about Mark Twain apologizing to someone that he was corresponding with, saying, "I apologize that my last letter was so long I didn't have time to write it." The challenge isn't writing the 1,000-page plan, filling it with three great bullet points that's important place for us to have.
I think one of the things, Laura, that I want to comment on is that we have a really intergenerational workplace. And that also means that we have really an intergenerational ecosystem for entrepreneurs. So I think one of the myths that exists like right now here today is that great storytellers are like of the folklore of old. And that when we think about a great storyteller, we position them culturally in a place that's where we were influenced most by culture, right? I'd be remiss, parents from Ireland, you think of like storytellers from our culture, like they'd be sitting around a turf fireplace in a pub and they'd be speaking like very low tones and everybody would be hushed to like listen. And so what I would say, Laura, is like, I want to break down that myth, right? So when I work with my clients today, my first question is kind of like, what do you think you're good at, right? And they might be like, well, I hate public speaking. It's like, okay, no problem. If you look on our phones right now, we actually have a generation of great storytellers. We just may not be appreciating the way that they're telling their stories. So whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, really what we're attracting people with, Paul, to go back to your question, is we are making some sort of empathy with our audience. We're creating it literally, that they are like, oh, I can relate to this person. One of the things that's quite fascinating, right? If you go back to like 80s, 90s marketing, right? When you think about like the Coke and Pepsi wars and how really professional their marketing was, today we've got influencers who are taking us really behind the scenes of what's going on in their life. And the more personal they get, the more likes, comments, and shares that they get with it. So, Laura, not going down the path of like the science of narrative just yet, but a myth that I think that we need to advance is that storytelling has been happening all around us for a lifetime. But maybe we need to open up and recognize that some of those millennials that are now entering the workforce and starting their companies, they're going to tell their story, and they're going to do it without ever making a formal presentation, right? Their pitch is going to come on TikTok. Their pitch is going to come on Instagram, and it's working. And I think some of us who think about traditional storytelling values as being gather around children, I think that we're going to have to open up our eyes and train and appreciate that style, which, by the way, is the perfect intersection between the generations, where some of the generations of old would have been really great at some of those kind of emotional pieces, and some of today's generations, Paul, as we were talking about before we started here, having those tech pieces. Well, instead of kind of like fighting it, right, let's actually find ways that we can bring them together. And what Pat said, and I'll finish on this idea, was, surround yourself with diversity of talent. And that means that if you're a great widget maker, it doesn't mean that you also have to be a bona fide professional presenter. You do need to find folks on your team that can be good at it. So I think, Laura, the answer that I gave to Paul earlier was like, they all have a story, but it doesn't mean that like everybody's going to be great at telling it. So spend some time, within your organization, within your teams, and identify like who are your great storytellers. So if it's in person, who's your best in person? If it's digital, let's go find us a digital person to create it. And let's not look at story as just being this thing that exists in a silo, but let's find ways to align our stories across all the channels that we're using.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple different strategies in terms of like making that connection with some of these just unbelievably arcane parts of our business. I love Joseph Campbell. I think he's you mentioned myths, Rory. I think in some ways, yes, how you tell a story is obviously going to change, but the what may not. And one of his structure of a hero is a hero who, came through the woods and had this mantle kind of thrust upon him. I went to apply for insurance for my wife. She's about to have a child, and I had this horrible experience. And I said, I never planned to enter the insurance business, but damn it, I said, I'm going to build this better application process. I've heard people take it that direction. It's about me as hero coming through to solve this thing. The other direction I've seen is to pull straw empathy is talk about the user, empathize and say, look, I found these people in this process. I had to help. This is the sort of change I need to make. Is there, if you kind of went through and said, how are those initial stories, how do I craft the story from what viewpoint? I'm the startup hero versus, you're the hero and I'm sort of here to help you on your journey. Are there two directions? Are there more? As you think through this?
I'm going to take my best shot at what I think, because I think it's a really profound question. To me, the story's always started with a flawed protagonist, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that I talk to about whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're just, trying to gain the attention of your team, your organization as a leader, is if you're presenting, if you are truly storytelling in a moment, you have purpose. And so what we talk to about is you're a flawed protagonist. If I didn't need the audience, if I didn't need resources, if the stakes weren't raised when you meet, the said antagonist in the novel, then there would be no purpose for the story. So I think it's actually really important for audiences, especially today, that you are willing to say, I have a great solution. I have the passion, enthusiasm, drive, and resources, but, right, and that's, okay, now I have you. Now I'm listening. But I don't have this, or I lack that, or I need your support financially, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is, to help me get through the final stage. And I can't help but think about, the Indiana Jones films, right? So one of the things that's always is you can bet on it, right, is that Indiana is going to be almost out the door, and there's that one last hitch that makes you go, oh no, I thought we were safe and we weren't. And for me, in the entrepreneurial journey, that's the moment when you've got the great idea, you've got your minimum viable product, you've come up with your go-to-market strategy, and everything's looking good. But something happens, right? There's your supply chain gets diminished, or maybe your customer model changes, or maybe the competition beats you to the idea, and you've got to have that Indiana Jones moments where you pivot. I think if you can tell your story from the flawed protagonist standpoint always, you're going to be relatable. You're going to be compelling. And I'll just go back to this idea of, like, it felt like to me when we look at, again, coming out of the 80s and the 90s, we had huge market shifts. We had tremendous growth. We had the power of the personal computer, and it put statistics on a platform, right? It allowed us to look at huge amounts of data very quickly, very easily. And we became obsessed with this idea of looking at those numbers. And I think we're seeing the rubber band finally snap back, where I think many of us as consumers or potential investors are saying, I can look at the data later. Like I can asynchronously, go through some of the pieces of that puzzle. I want to know what makes you special. I want to know why I want to work with you. And so I'm excited to see, like, story be brought back to the forefront. And now it's this great buzzword, and we're seeing it because it tells me that at the end of the day, human nature will always want to empathize with that main, that lead character, that flawed protagonist. So I think they start there, Paul. That's at least what I'm going to try today to say.
Yeah, flawed protagonist. Patrick, how do I know in politics? How do I know in business? If I've connected with my story and my flaws are embraced by the market before I have a sale.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I think we're sort of, it feels like we're walking around, a word that keeps popping into my head, which is authenticity. And I think that's where you need to have your feet pretty firmly planted on who you are and what you're about, and be prepared to defend it. Because speaking sort of shallowly or superficially about what you're trying to represent to your audience that you believe, and they can see that it's thin or insubstantial, that's deadly. So I think having, really would be two things: is really owning your message, notwithstanding the fact that you may need to adjust and pivot around some of the subplots, but really knowing the core value of what it is that you're looking to communicate is critical. Where we're in a really weird spot now is back to something that Rory mentioned about the 80s and the 90s. What an awesome time to be a communicator, you own one hat, you wore one hat, and it all worked very well. You know, a ton of the folks, trying to raise money. It was pretty straightforward. You're up on the 40th floor of these impressive buildings with impressive people trying to make their pay. When you wanted to go out to those trade outlets, say an insurance company, for example, a small group of them, you knew who these folks were, you knew the people, the reporters who were on your beat. It was a really limited, focused, familiar ecosystem of the afternoon communications you're on. Now, it's pretty shattered into a million. Your audience is in 100 different places with more demands on their time, getting bombarded with content from all corners. And you have to both be positioned to speak to well-informed, astute audiences who understand what it is that you're talking about, who may not even have the same power or influence as somebody on LinkedIn or Twitter who knows a fraction of what an informed audience might know, but that would nonetheless, that won't stop them from opining on what it is that you say. And now you're looking over at this person or this group that's throwing tomatoes at your great idea, and you're saying, I have to deal with this now? And the answer is yes, you have to deal with this. So I think that a really strong understanding of your audiences, channels where they may be, notwithstanding that you may have a primary audience, you really want to be in front of, insurance trades, so that you raise the profile of the company. You want to be in front of the VC community, so you're starting to think that you can't take your eye off the ball for something random. Out of the clear blue sky event may happen, and you have to pivot quickly and address it with a lot of things. The best way to do that, in my view, is that you're prepared. So you have thought through your message, you've thought through the pitfalls and the questions that you might get, and then you can at least be prepared to react relatively quickly. What they say is, by the time you've heard the thunder, it's too late to feel the darkness. They know this stuff. Embrace it, own it, be prepared for it, and that way, you're going to be well suited to interact with priority audiences and also to take generic from other folks that may not have your judgment.
Would you recommend that I respond and now have a presence on TikTok? How do we address a situation like that where our message is out there, but it might be coming through channels that we're not prepared to answer to?
Yeah, I'll take a quick run at it, and then let the younger, more digitally astute McGloin correct whatever I said is wrong. Our default setting is particularly where a lot of times you can do a garden variety, well-intentioned question for critique, not necessarily something looking to tear you down, typically happening on social. First things first, it's a move off. So the extent to which it's possible, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever these things are happening, that it's not just a positive opportunity for an ongoing exchange. There's got some hair on it, and if you don't want this conversation to happen with you in public, DM, reach out, do everything you can to get the conversation moved offline, see if you can resolve that. If it doesn't get resolved, and you're just finding via, media monitoring or otherwise, that there are conversations happening about community or issues, products and companies in channels where you are not participating, you don't have too much resources. You don't have to get out of the water. Rory,
no, and I think, Laura, that would have been my default to say, I'd call Pat as a public relations professional and say, what do you advise in this circumstance? The one thing that popped into my mind that we work with entrepreneurs and with startups is going to be control your space. And ultimately what I mean by that is that you really need to identify, probably from a digital standpoint, like what channel is most conducive to your product or service? Like where do you really want to do customer discovery? I think about spaces like LinkedIn, and one of the things that's fascinated me, I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, over the last year, LinkedIn went from a space that was uber professional, right? It would be sharing accolades, job postings, attaboys for our colleagues. And now all of a sudden we're starting to see posts that are really personal. You know, I see parents sharing accolades or stories about their children. I see people who have overcome adversity. I see stuff that I thought was more native for Facebook. And if you're following this trend, you're kind of going, is LinkedIn a place anymore that you are going to utilize as a, you know, propeller for your business or for your startup? And I'm starting to say, I don't think it is. It's not what it used to be anymore. It's not attracting the webinar-like traffic, right? LinkedIn, of course, captured that on their own with their own learning space. So what am I saying here, Laura? Is like, for me, you go, what's my space? And if your company and customer discovery is not going down on TikTok, yes, you call Pat and you say, can you help us navigate this scenario? But at the same time, I know my space is Instagram, or I know my space is Facebook, or I know my space is in the local trade organizations. You have to have control over your space. I find it quite interesting that today, and I'm going to go really organic on this one, that we still have a phenomena when we look at our trades and we look at folks who are trying to scale trades, right? We recognize more than ever the importance of folks with vocational skills coming into our homes, coming into our neighborhoods to provide goods and services, and yet there's still a relatively low percentage of folks who have websites. And you're saying, well, why don't you own your space? Because if and when, right, somebody puts up a bad review, somebody Yelps you, somebody gives you a Google business review that maybe isn't fair or accurate, do you have a space that you can control your narrative? And if the answer is no, if you don't own your own web space, which of course to many of us would seem crazy, but to many of our small businesses, they haven't been supported in this way, right? So they missed the revolution. They were out working hard in the late 90s and early 2000s. They established a business, and now they're going, do I need this? That's the question I get, by the way, when I talk to folks out in the public is, do I really need this, right? And I think about this exact scenario, and I say to them, what happens when you are losing control of your narrative? Do you have one space that you could direct your customers or prospective customers to and say, yeah, I know you saw this review, but look at the hundreds of testimonials that I have posted on my web space, and then consider giving me a call and letting me earn your business. So for me, pick your channel, own your space. If your space is TikTok, then you're diving in and you're answering the question on TikTok. But if it's not, I would just be saying, let's direct our constituents back to where we own, and hopefully that's a really well-designed website that is clean and clear and succinct and has our values right there. So when you close the page, people are remembering your values for days and hopefully weeks to come.
So digging in real quick, you had mentioned LinkedIn being a space that's changing, and I see the messaging changing on there as well. Do you think that it had something to do with all of us becoming more human in the last, say, 15 months? Where I see people putting parent, right? So I'm a vice president of, I'm a parent, I'm a this, I'm a that. And I find it interesting. I think it's great we're celebrating all the roles in which we play, because I think a lot of us have multiple hats that we wear. But do you think it's because we all had the chance to see inside of living rooms and offices and see the children driving the Matchbox cars over your head? That happened to me in workspaces where that would have never traditionally been a norm.
100%, Laura. So we did some preliminary investigations on this. We have some ongoing research on this topic. And that's exactly what we found, was that people were void of human connection. And they basically said, well, you're in my home now, so let me share this great story that I overcame, something on the weekend. Or let me tell you this great story about how my travel soccer team overcame this journey and won a game. And you're like, this is a Facebook post, right? And yet, and we've been following the trends on this, tens of thousands of likes on what we're considering non-traditional or non-professional shares. And we did take that giant step back and said, what is happening? And we think that people are craving human connection. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if and when we return to the workplace over the next 18 months, if that trend remains. And of course, we've seen the reports even out this morning from Forbes. There was an article. People are reluctant to want to dive back into the space. What's that going to mean for office expectations and norms? I don't know. But yeah, Laura, that was what we saw, and we would hypothesize that will remain as long as we remain virtual. What happens to LinkedIn if we do go back to the workspace is going to be pretty interesting.
Well, I think Jamie Dimon said, I read something where, like, in October, we'll all be back to the same world as it was before.
Not a chance.
Not a chance. I write. It's like we never go back in time. The question is, what are we going forward to? And I like Laura, your question around, like, is it just that work and family and personal life have suddenly blended, where we're all now feel like a little more like independent contractors? So there's still a story there. I guess, Rory, Patrick, I'd be interested to get your perspective on it, on sort of what are the structures of a story. Now, I heard somebody talk about this once, and it just has worked so well for me to say, look, a good story element has three parts to it. There's an and, there's a but, and there's a therefore, right? You've got sort of story element, I came through the woods, I found that I needed to apply for life insurance, and I did it. But it was oh so hard. Therefore, I took this mission on myself and said, I'm going to change the way the industry is working. Conflict, you've got resolution. How do you talk to your clients, your startups, and say, look, here are the parts you got to have in your narrative for it to be a story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just tackle this for a few seconds. I think Pat gives us an opportunity to add some anecdotal evidence to potentially support where this works, or maybe in industries where it doesn't. So I'm a huge fan of all Randy Olson's works, and what he really did was kind of catalog for us that and, but, therefore method, which he very openly says, look, it's not mine, I'm just making it more accessible, which I loved and appreciated about his work. So for me, Paul, one of the things that we talk about, right, is that ordinary reality, or like where we are right now. And I think that that's how you create empathy. That is how you build relationships. In particular, if you think about audiences that are likely to disagree with you or be apathetic, you must build some connection built around empathy early days, and that's sharing that ordinary reality. So like that and is, we're currently living in an environment, whereas your example, insurance is really important and critical, but it's hard to kind of understand how to get it, right? And then we kind of set it up from there. So creating empathy through sharing an ordinary reality. And I think that oftentimes when I see for, big pitches in front of investors, they skip the part where they see the venture capitalist as a dollar sign sitting across the table. And to go back to Laura's point, no, that's a mom, that's a dad, that's a soccer coach, that's somebody who runs a volunteer organization. They do various things throughout the week that have nothing to do with their professional job. That's where they're going to buy into you, right? Because they're going to see this as being, oh yeah, I've experienced that as well. So ordinary reality. And then the last thing, Paul, that I won't over elaborate because you kind of set up the 3-act structure that we like to use. Something that I've been empathizing with my audiences is this idea that you need to bring people in the story right to where we are today. So I think too often what happens is calls to action are made on a more ambivalent level than we prefer. And what I mean by that is like, therefore, we're seeking $100,000 in seed funding to be able to get our app to the next level. That's not like right here, right now, this day, this time, this place, this seat that I'm in. And that has been kind of transformative for me as a coach, where I've been pushing my clients to try to say, when you finish the story, bring them to 11:46 Friday, right here, right now. That's why we're sitting here, because it gives you meaning and purpose. Now you're like, oh my God, this amazing story that started in the jungle ends here today in this seat. And all of a sudden they can actually put themselves in the story. So that's a little thing that we've kind of been working in, where we don't just end with a call to action, we end to, and that's how we got here right now. And to go back to, Patrick's, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens kind of idea, was this idea that like, it does take a long time to make it short. So at least if it's too long, if I can find a way to bring you into it and get you invested in the moment, I've got a shot that we simply might continue the conversation. And I think, Laura, maybe your last myth there, and this was something that I learned in my own storytelling workshops along the way. As a longtime professor, I always felt compelled to make a point. I had to have like the noble ending of like, therefore, Paul, we should always remember to do what? And I was quickly kind of submit out of that thinking and saying, respect your audience's intelligence and ability, and don't make it something that they have to, recite back to you that they got the point. When we all finish watching the exact same movie, we walk away feeling a little bit differently, and that's totally okay. And I think sometimes as storytellers, we think we have to control the way that they feel afterwards. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility, I think, is to provoke and then let them have an opportunity to deal with that. And that's something that for amateur storytellers or for folks who have never gone deep diving into it, it's really hard to let go of that because you feel responsible for the audience's outcome, and that may not actually be the case.
If I could just dovetail on that quickly, what Rory was talking about, we a lot of times in prepping our clients for opportunities, speaking opportunities, editorial boards or what have you. it's not necessarily a pleasant process to go through, but there are times where you have to ask the question again and again, which is so what? So you have the origins, you have the problem you're looking to solve, you have the therefore. If you're falling short on the so what piece of this, you're going to have a problem. You might be okay with some audiences, you might be okay for a little while with a bunch of audiences, but eventually, if you're missing that punch that is going to make it memorable, either because you delivered a data point that is going to change their lives, or and I agree, a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of generating empathy and emotional connection. To the extent to which that's possible, it can be woven into your story. So much the better. But you do need to pass the so what test, particularly with astute audiences. You're the fourth group that's been in front of them today. You're the 10th pitch they've gotten that week. You do need to sort of find a way to cope through it. The other thing that we work with folks on, and Paul, in your prior political experience, you may have seen this. There are stories about Bill Clinton on the stump in New Hampshire during the New Hampshire primary in 1991. That the press corps traveling with him in the back of the room would recite the lip sync along with his stump. He's a very talented, obviously successful politician, but he was one of the first folks that out from sort of behind the closed doors in the back rooms of how these things work, the idea of message discipline sort of made its way into the mainstream consciousness. You need to have the discipline, even when it feels a little bit forced and potentially even a little bit contrived. When you have that opportunity to get in front of the audiences that matter, you have the discipline to get those key points across, because with this shattering of what used to be a handful of core audiences that you could do a pretty good job getting your audience across, you now have hundreds and hundreds of sets of ears and eyes that it's just that much harder to get your message across. If you want to do it successfully and consistently, you're going to have to really wrap your
simple.
arms around
I think it's the more we talk to people, the more channels there are, the more the message has to be small and a few words. And I don't want to go too far off on politics, but I think look. Trump was so successful with, Make America Great Again, right? Put it on a hat, everybody recites it. Hillary Clinton, I'm not sure what her campaign message was, right? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of policy, but I don't think she ever connected with the story there. I was actually, by the way, interested. I was working politics in that 91 cycle, and it was really interesting. Certain people could connect very simply with. And it wasn't, the communication wasn't even necessarily the words, it was sort of like how they physically related to an audience when they were in a room. We were running against one candidate who, I swear, every single meeting we went to, everybody thought they were a personal friend of this candidate. He must have had like 5,000 personal friends. And they all said that. I'm a close personal friend of fill-in-the-blank candidate. It was astonishing. He clearly used the same word and said, hey, I want to introduce myself. This is my close personal friend. Everywhere he went. And it worked. He'd been in office for 20 years at that point. So.
Yeah, and at the risk of dragging out the political piece of this, I just mention another thing that I think sort of speaks to the need to fight the war on multiple fronts. You're out there with the press, you're out there with your trade association, you're engaging on TikTok if you have to, or LinkedIn or what have you. This may seem a little bit of a strange example, but the sheer head count of the number of people who received handwritten notes from George H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, is absolutely staggering. You could have met him in a rope line hand-shaking event for all of 15 seconds because you cut a $500 check at the fundraiser. A week later, you would open up your mail and there's a handwritten note. Dear Paul, great to see you down in Florida. Hope you and the family do. And the number of people is in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, it's an example of you having a little bit of creativity and presence of mind to try and find other and new ways to connect with folks. And right there, you didn't need to be reminded that you met the president. You didn't forget it. I have to imagine someone taking the amount of time that it took to do that, if nothing else, deepened presumably your warm feelings for that person. So it is sort of incumbent on us to always try and find those new ways to connect with those audiences, even if it's thinking outside the box a little bit. And like Rory was saying, owning, it could be part of owning your narrative that you're doing something that's a little unexpected. Did you convey new information? Not necessarily. Did you get them to understand something new or different about you? No.
So,
but did you reinforce how they felt about you? Very possible.
Or I'd say the modern equivalent of a startup note. Rory, what is that today? I just pitched. I spoke to an investor. I spoke to I was on a Zoom call with 3 execs at an insurance company where I'd like them to buy my services. What do I do to stand out? Right? What is that today? Is it still a handwritten note?
Yeah, I don't think the handwritten note goes anywhere. For those of us raising children, we're probably still saying, "Hey, get the thank you card out and send your aunt a nice thank you card." And so I certainly am not going to not endorse that. What's interesting for me, Paul, is that our time. The norm surrounding time is that everybody is busier. We have, limited bandwidth, right? That's such a great phrase that we hear so often. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact on this, right? We had thought in the past that direct outreach, direct connection, that was the way to go. And I think getting something in the mail seems more novel now if it's not from Amazon. But one of the things that does strike me is that when you talk to young influencers, right? And I have a few folks that are young influencers, YouTube stars, if you will. They'll actually say, get on your Instagram, flip open your camera, throw it on live, no matter where you are, no matter what you're wearing, and just riff. And what's interesting about that is that those of us coming on the call today, making sure that we were professional, we're going, whoa, right? That I don't know if I'm there yet, right? But the younger generation is actually appreciating that because that's direct to them. So we have something that we've never had in the history of time, right? Is that your politicians, your celebrities, your social influencers, right, of old are now directly accessible. And they're flipping on their cameras, going live, and you're saying, they're talking to me. So what I might suggest is that the best way to do that, to showcase your relative authenticity, and so that's a whole nother podcast, Pat, to probably go down the road on what happens when authenticity becomes completely produced and we're not sure if the behind the scenes is actually not just another completely made up thing. But in the very short term, I think I would be encouraging folks to expose yourself, bring your personal life into your professional areas, as Laura was talking about earlier, because we're seeing that the younger generations are appreciating that the facade is being taken down. Many of the entrepreneurs, right, felt like they had to impress to even get in the room anymore. Well, guess what? There's no room anymore, right? There is no 40th floor. There's no elevator gatekeeper. If you want to pitch, go pitch. The barriers to entry are almost minimal, right? You don't need a ticket to Shark Tank to have a shot at this thing, right? You can go on any of the startup websites right now, and you can go and try to make your pitch there. So I would say the new note is actually opening up the app, going on Instagram Live, putting yourself out there, and speaking directly to those of your supporters, your investors, your constituents, your employees directly. We haven't seen it yet. Go look at the Fortune 200s. We have not seen a lot of the CEOs yet kind of go, all right, I'm in, I'm showing up, here's me live. We haven't seen it yet. But when we look at some of the younger generation companies, it would be asinine to think that their young CEOs wouldn't be putting themselves on Instagram. So the intergenerational thing comes back there a little bit. And that would be my advice for anybody listening today, thinking about how can I be different? Turn on the camera, go live, and let's see who you really are behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch how communication tactics have played out over the last 15 plus months. And, as Patrick might say, the literal corner office is about as useful as a screen door in a submarine. It just, the value just, it might not be there anymore because, to your point, there's no physical office right now for a lot of people. And I know that we're going to be returning to the workplace. What is that going to look like? And I want to use it as a segue into the question to ask you both. If you had to take a guess, knowing what we know today at 11:58 on Friday, what what does 2 months from now look like? What does the hybrid environment look like, and how can we be effective within it? So we're used to the Zoom platform. In a lot of ways, it's been really, really effective to get in front of people, to read their physical reactions to commentary, et cetera. But now when we're back in the office, yet we're still dealing with coworkers who are remote, what do you think that's going to play out like?
I think that the most important thing, to be honest with you, is really to listen, because you've got a natural tension between this. I think that maybe a Bloomberg poll recently said 87% of the folks want to be hybrid. Jamie Dimon said that the office is going to be where the hustlers. You're going to hustle, you have to be in the office. I mean, Jamie Dimon's a smart guy. But that reveals really a natural tension that I really do think has to be squared. You're hearing about real squeeze on the employee side. You've got employers that are scrambling, paying bonuses for folks just to come in and interview. So I think as long as as long as it's a little bit of a buyer's market, things are tipped, slightly in favor of the workforce, you really incumbent upon you as an employer to really listen and have an understanding of what people are looking for. Zoom absolutely solved a ton of short-term problems when we all first had to go remote. Unbelievable asset and a great help. I think as we got to the end of the 15 months, people were a little zoomed out and were saying, why do I have to put my camera on? Could we just run a conference call? I don't want to discount, and I think everybody on this call would agree with it. There's certainly a value of getting your team together, so to speak, in person, whether it's collaborating in the office, outside the office, in social or volunteer capacity. There is a lot of connective tissue that can be sustained there, and I think it's valuable for your organization. But as long as people are able to be productive, be successful, working on a hybrid, working under a hybrid approach that none of us have seen before, I think you'd be really smart to listen to folks to the extent you can. And obviously, not every industry is able to do this. Tailor your approach to accommodating those folks in a way that really does hear them and is respectful of how they like to work.
I think about it like this, Laura. What do you want your culture of interdependence to be? How much do you want your employees relying on each other directly or indirectly to not just be able to carry out day-to-day activities, but to what degree do you want your culture, right? Some of those elements, those intangibles, to be also interdependent. And I think that's why we used the example earlier. Well, we saw all this personal sharing on LinkedIn because we weren't getting the water cooler conversation. We weren't hearing the stories about the new babies or the new puppies or the people that passed away and that really just kind of shape our life. Okay, so for me, I think about it like this. It comes down to a cultural decision. Do you want your employees to be interdependent on one another culturally, not just task-oriented, but do you want there to be culture? And if so, how do you utilize either channel? This is my take on this, Laura, and this is where I'm sitting right now today. I've been asked to do training and development workshops on returning to a hybrid workplace. We have been diving deep into the literature to try to figure out what can we lean on or rely on. And here's what's really interesting, right? We went back to early days of online education when hybrid was introduced. So you can go back even as far as the 90s, and you can start to see introductions of hybrid learning, which meant that we flipped the classroom, we took some of the learning, put it online, and then we came together, we did our activities. But let's pause for a second, right? And let's look at the obvious thing staring us in the face, and that is that there were two channels, and they were used independently. You did this online, and you did this online. And what I think, offline, and what I think one of the utopian vibes that's coming out of this post-COVID world is this idea that, well, hybrid means that we can actually have a meeting where if you want to be in the office, you can be in the office, and if you want to be at home, you can also be on the meeting. And my recommendation right now to organizations from where I sit is that's not a thing. Technology is not there. I was in conferences on the West Coast all the way back as far as 2006 where they were trying to sell telepresent systems, right? Everybody could have virtual eye contact. Well, it's 2021 and go around in the boardrooms and very few of our Fortune 500s ever ended up actually adopting them. What's sitting in the center of the table? The same conference platform that's been there for like the last 30 years, which tells me that we may want to kind of be a little bit hesitant with how we use this hybrid word. To me, hybrid is we come to the office Tuesday and Thursday because that's when we socialize and that's when we do our creative think tanks and we get together and we share energy Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we go home and we do our tasks. And I would like us to really reflect as employees, as organizations, as to like, what part of a culture do I want to be a part of? If you are somebody who just loves sharing energy in a physical space with people and need that to fuel your soul, then yeah, you might be handing in some 2-week notices over the next couple months and finding a place that respects and enjoys that. They exist, right? And if you're somebody who doesn't need that, you probably can excel and have a way better professional career. And so I think about all the young people entering the workforce. They now, for the first time in a long time, are actually going to need to start with maybe not even what industry, right? But what culture am I attracted to? Because if I can put myself in the right organizational scheme or system, I genuinely believe that their prosperity and their careers will be a lot more pronounced earlier on than maybe it took for many of us to go through iterations of different types of organizations or channels to be able to find the one that fit who we are. And the last thing I'll say is organizations are going to need to get out in front of this. Entrepreneurs, startups, you got to get out in front of this. What type of culture do you want? Are you going to be brick and mortar? Are you going to be online? Are you going to be hybrid? And at what cost? Attracting talent is now going to be, predicted, as Pat was saying, by, well, what do you expect of me and where and when do I have to be at that place? And so attract talent, maybe beginning just with that alone. That could be more important than salary and benefits as we move forward.
Well,
I just want to, sorry, Paul, just one thing I just tack onto that, sorry, is we've been seeing this with a bunch of clients. I think that no one really has the silver bullet of an answer. I think all of Rory's points on culture are absolutely well taken. You also understand that some people, it's really the tangible that I'm spending X dollars in terms of my commute, what I have to spend on dress, clothes, all that other stuff. So when you combine that, it's a pretty murky future that we're looking at. I would agree 100% with Rory. Be out in front of it. I would stress that you really need to listen. And I would also really stress transparency, because I think that you may not have all the answers right now. You and your leadership team may only be looking out at the next couple months or the next quarter. Say that you're planning on trying this approach for this period of time, that we're gonna measure, we're gonna get feedback from folks, and we're gonna evaluate going forward. That, I think, just disclosing the fact that you don't have a locked-in answer, that you're being transparent in your process.
Yeah,
I think will carry a lot of weight.
I'm sure. I think we'll end up with better and better questions. Rory, over the next and Patrick, over the next 6 months, then we'll have answers. Like, what is culture? Is it our salad bar at our company forced more people to bump into each other than company B? Right? Is we all wore blue shirts, they wore white shirts. What is work about? Is it just sitting next to Laura while I do more conference calls? This will be fascinating. This will be fascinating over a period of time. I read one book right at the beginning to try to think through how we were going to adapt. It was a book called The Year of Working Without Pants. No, it was not a for mature audiences book, but it was about the company that Automatic that built WordPress, and that's a $2 billion company that has really never had anybody working in an office. Now, as I read through this, it was kind of an interesting story. A guy from Microsoft drops in to sort of change culture and stuff. Yeah, good luck in a company like that. And but they very carefully selected for people who would work successfully on a remote basis, and I kind of found it fascinating. You wouldn't necessarily just they wouldn't just hire somebody. You'd get a 6-month contract, and you'd mutually see if it worked out. So this will be interesting to see how companies change or don't change over time, and can they change, if they want to change. I don't know, Laura, what's your take?
I think it's interesting, because a lot's going to come down to what does employment look like? Who's in the driver's seat? I think previously it was the employers in the driver's seat in a lot of cases, where people would want the jobs. They want to go to that company because X, Y, or Z. But now we're in a spot where you could work anywhere in the world. If a company now offers remote opportunities, it's kind of putting the power back into the employee's hands to say, to the earlier points, is this how I want to work? How do I feel when I'm asked to do this? Am I feeling pressured versus am I feeling as though I have input into a situation. And if that doesn't jive with my personal viewpoints, there could be an advantage for employees to then say, this isn't working. It's been great, learned a lot. Let's go find something that might line up better for me. And it's interesting to think about, the comment earlier and thinking, I think people going into the workforce will be able to be more successful sooner, being happier as individuals versus going into, insurance to go into insurance, even though I'm not, not too sure how many people actually feel that way if you're not an actuary. It's fascinating.
Well, if we drive this to your point, okay, it's now June 4th at 12:09. Innovation in Hartford. So I'll sort of tell you, our story was, hey, we had bought this company, but we had all this extra space, and we want to do something for community. All these interesting startups from all the world come here, and hopefully you hire some people from Hartford, but we're going to bring the innovation here, and that's going to help the community because we're getting these jobs and these people sitting here. Now, you kind of fast forward to where we are today, and Laura's been right at the tip of the spear of this, is say, maybe the opportunity is actually taking the talent in Hartford and pushing this out to the rest of the world. How many interns did you place from Connecticut around the world this year?
Yeah, it was a great opportunity. We had partnering with UConn and UHeart on their insurtech program, and we had 14 interns, go across the world. So some were local, some were, name your favorite country. It was just a wonderful opportunity to bring students that are located physically within Connecticut, and even some that weren't at that point due to remote learning, and share that talent. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, just because we have the understanding that we can do this, and we don't have to go abroad physically to make it happen.
Yeah. Do you think this gives more? Do you think this new normal creates more opportunities for entrepreneurial activity, or people who want to get entrepreneurial jobs in Connecticut a chance to do it, where without going to Boston, without going to New York or San Francisco? I don't know, Patrick or Rory. What are your thoughts there?
Quickly, I would just say this is an opportunity. We've seen, obviously, finally, concepts of diversity and inclusion being at the forefront of mission statements. They're living now on the home pages for just about every company on the planet. Okay, well, now you've got an opportunity, right? If you want to create a culture that emphasizes this, why would you not open your hiring market up to theoretically the entire world? And not for nothing, you've got an opportunity now to hire to solve, customer issues, right? So we're struggling with this type of customer. We're struggling with a certain demographic. We're struggling to make inroads in certain communities. Well, why not actually solve two problems, right? Why not make your company more inclusive? Why not make your clientele more inclusive, and do it by taking advantage of the fact that you don't have to hire somebody because they live within 25 miles of Hartford? So when we talk about, and this was brought up, and I think Pat's point was interesting on this, right, was like it was everybody was excited to celebrate Zoom, a year and a half ago. And now that we're thankfully vaccinated, it's like, hey, come on back to the workplace. And everybody's like, well, hold on a second. I thought that this was great. You told me 6 months ago this was the best thing ever. Why did that change? So we are going to there's going to be some push and pull. And for the first time in a long time, or at least in my lifetime I'll speak to, it does feel like maybe the employees have a little bit more power and leverage in some of these circumstances. And we're going to get a chance to see if some of our larger, more influential organizations are going to be able to create culture that embraces what their talent, or supposedly respected talent, wants. And so when they talk about, supporting these missions, okay, well, let's see it, right? There's nothing stopping you, so we'll get to see how that plays out.
You know who we're missing in this conversation? We wouldn't need to drag the innocent person from Nassau in on this conversation, but a facilities or real estate, person from the leadership team of a large employer. I'd love to get their perspective on when the prospect of still attracting highly skilled, trained, productive workforce, balancing that against whatever you're paying for a square foot in these cities all around the country. The real estate person reporting up the food chain saying, guys, I think I just found some savings, and and I think everybody's going to like it. Now, we're not going to have acres of cubicles staffed with bright happy hardworking people. They're going to be home, and we're going to save a ton of money. So I'm out of my depth in terms of being able to analyze that plus and minus. But
oh yeah, hey Wilson, we're way over time. Laura,
part of the
what else?
calculation. Just at the end of the day, when you're adding up dollars and
we'll have
cents.
to bring you both back, and maybe we'll have the relative authenticity conversation, because it's it's an interesting path to go down, and maybe we'll do it in a few months when we get a chance to see how companies and employees are handling the shift, and what messages are still true and what messages may have just been an empty offering at the time. So it'll be interesting, as this conversation was today, and want to thank you both for taking the time to be here with Paul and I, but we'll have to do it again.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, thanks for your time, and everybody's listening. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much.
Indeed. Great to be with you guys.